But what a fantastic weekend, and thank you, John and the committee, for your kind invitation, both to join you last night for the banquet and to come and talk this morning. It's really something very special indeed, because the world is focusing a lot on 2025. Something happened in 2025, or will happen in 2025. Something happened in 1825. That's a little bit away in the future, but I love the fact that we are here to celebrate Hetton Colliery Railway 200, because of course without Hetton nothing else would have happened. And I bring to mind, I'm often reminded by Les's comment at a talk that he gave many years ago, that currently there are more years of railway history prior to 1825 than there were after. And I think that's a wonderful thing. So congratulations to all, congratulations to the committee for a fantastic celebration. You really have put Hetton on the international railway heritage map. And the quality of the speakers, because although I couldn't join you yesterday, I was watching online, or looking at the recordings. It really is something that we're here to celebrate now. But of course there is one guest that was missing from the party, and bless her, that was Hetton Lion. And Hetton Lion was indeed asked for by various folks from the organising committee, and it would have been lovely to have her here to celebrate 200 years of the railway. But unfortunately, the National Railway Museum, we have certain obligations that we have to undertake when we're looking after our collection, and much as it would be marvellous to put her on a low loader and bring her up here, the decision isn't just mine, it's down to a number of different teams, a number of colleagues who all sit there and say, well, what are the benefits, what are the costs, what are the risks, all that sort of thing. And we have to look at our locos, our collection, as artefacts in their own right. So what I'm going to do for the next half an hour or so is talk a little bit about the conservation of 19th century locos. And that could take us all day if I really went to it all. But as I say, I'm going to look at some of the high points and the low points and why we do what we do. And possibly debunk some of the challenges that have been raised over the years. As John said, I'm Senior Curator of Rail Transport and Technology. That's probably the longest job title in the museum. It's certainly why I don't have a business card anymore, because it doesn't fit. But I actually have one of the smallest collections. And actually the rail vehicle collection of the NRM accounts for 0.00014%. But it's a bit like a spoilt child. It takes a lot of attention. You know, it is what it is, and I do what I do. And for the next half hour, I shall attempt to explain a little bit about the challenges we face looking after 19th century locomotives. The museum pieces. Rocket here at York, very much as well, not as was when it entered the Patent Office collection, and Michael Bailey wrote a superb book about the engineering and history of Rocket. It takes everything to pieces. We'll talk about Michael's work a little bit later. Apologies, Michael. But I have seen it on internet forums recently that somebody came to York and said, oh no, Rocket's just it's a little black lump. It's a lump of iron. It's useless. And I challenged them. I said, well, why is Rocket useless? And he said, oh, it'll never pull a train again. And that's one of the challenges that we face at the museum, is that as enthusiasts, as historians, we are used to locomotives running. Whether it's at Tanfield, whether it's at Bowes, whether it's at North Tyneside, North York Moors, we like to see our engines running. But there comes a time where, is it a museum piece? Is it a locomotive? Is it both? Don't know. A locomotive or an antique? Now, okay, that's the replica Rocket being put into Liverpool Road, Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, for an event a few years ago. And you can see we're all shoving it away, you know. And yet, the original Rocket, most of it, a lot of it dates from the 1830s. Would you treat it like that? Would you grab hold of it and push it? Would you move it? It's still on wheels, But when does it stop being a locomotive? When does it start being an antique, a museum piece? Or is it both? I'm going to pose a lot of questions this morning and not necessarily going to answer them because there is no one size fits all. We get a lot of people, some of you will see on the internet or in magazines, that the National Railway Museum has stuffed and mounted a locomotive because that's what they do. That's their policy. It isn't. We don't have a single policy that says what we're going to do with any one machine. And I say antique there. We did an event at Locomotion a few years ago, and a gentleman from West Yorkshire came up to me and he said, well, he said, you're keeper of the Queen's relics, aren't you? And then that was summed up even further by a dear friend of mine from Wiltshire, who is now sadly deceased. And when I got the position of senior curator, he said, it's a beautiful Wiltshire accent. He said, you used to be a cobweb keeper. He says, now you're a senior cobweb keeper. There's a lot more to it than that. But it is the question, are these things locomotives? Are they antiques? Are they museum pieces? Are they all of them? We're down as being precious museum curators sometimes, and I've heard that from many people over the 25 years that I've worked in the museum business. But there have been different approaches to collections, care, and transport, interpretation and display over the years. So there on the left is locomotion number 1. You won't see much more of it this morning, I promise you, but it does appear throughout this because there it is, put on that plinth in the late 1850s, 1857 in Darlington, and it's there, it's venerated. There's our gentleman with his top hat looking at it with the children as a piece of history, a monument, as it were, almost at that time. And yet, there it is, surrounded by trees out in the open. Now, we've attached all sorts of symbolism and imagery and ideas to that engine over the years, and I dare say we probably would never do that again. And yet that was a thing in the 19th century, that locomotives were put on plinths. They were put there as something to remind people. So Billy, which you spoke about yesterday, was on the high-level bridge in Newcastle. Invicta was out in a park in Canterbury. And locomotion number 1 was on a plinth in Darlington. You fast forward to 2021, and there it is now in the museum at Locomotion. This was March 2021, just after we'd moved it, and you can see it's in a cradle because, unlike Rocket there, it's fragile, its wheels, we don't want to run a risk of it. And again, 20 years ago, I can remember moving Agenoria, the shot end locomotive at York, 1829, similar age to Rocket. And one of my colleagues moved it and bent a part of it. And in typical, beautifully laconic Yorkshire way, because he was from the York Carriage Works originally, he said, and I shall remove the expletives, he said, what's it matter? It's never going to run again. I think he missed the point. Bless him, he's passed away now, but that is why we're precious museum curators. Things do get bent if we don't look after them. Things do rot. And we'll look at some of that as well during the next few minutes. What I also will enjoy, well, I hope we'll enjoy it, is when I've finished speaking, I'm going to allow about 10 to 15 minutes for discussion and questions, etc., because I think that's one of the most exciting and interesting and important times, is that I don't just stand up here. It's ironic it's a Sunday morning and I'm a former church warden, sort of give the morning prayers out. But I think it's important that rather than being seen as the National Railway Museum telling you how it is, we actually have a two-way discussion and dialogue so that, we all work out how it all fits. And if you've got questions, the daftest question is the one that you don't ask, I always reckon. I may well regret that by 11:15, but we'll give it a go anyway. So what do we know? That's the other thing, precious museum curators, they know nothing. They're all academics, accountants and administrators. The NRM's gone downhill. It's full of cafes and playgrounds and whatnot. Well, for this morning I am they. But what do we know? What do we know? You know, these engines from the 19th century, they've been around physically a very long time. There's a lot been written about them. And a lot of it was written quite a long time ago. Like people like at the time of John Scholes and the British Transport Commission Committee on Historic Relics, that was where it was. You know, I grew up reading O.S. Nock and H.C. Castley, the little Observer's book of British steam locomotives. That was everything that I knew. And it was wrong, I found since. But we'll carry on with that as we go. So what do we know? Museum object history files, they're really useful because they are files as per that slipcase where every object has its history written down through correspondence, through articles, through other research that's been done. And some of these engines have a very slim file. Some of them have several files deep. So, for example, I'm going to jump into the 20th century now, but we have a certain big green steam engine. I'm not sure I can mention its name on a Sunday morning, but we have a big green steam engine which celebrates its 100th anniversary next year. The file for that engine, there are about 5 of them that deep, but that's its history. It's not necessarily history that's going to be written in a book and made public because some of it's quite dry, but it's there that tells us where things have happened, where things have moved, what work's been done. So, for example, some of the engines, the 19th century collection, were repainted at various railway works in the 1970s to go into the National Railway Museum. And we have things like the bill for painting from Derby Locomotive Works for the Midland Spinner, things like that. It's all that part of really maybe quite dry, quite arcane. But if somebody's turning around, you know, one of the things we do get is people say about the paint finish on a loco, you can't touch that, it's original. Or those precious museum curators won't let us touch them because they think it's original. Well, actually, we do know because we've got it on the files for these things. But there's a lot that we don't know. So we turn to museum guidebooks and catalogues, you know, from when the Railway Museum was opened at Queen Street in York, and things were written down then. And then, of course, the catalogues for the MRM since 1975. But then we find more through magazine articles and enthusiast research, and those can also end up in the history files. And I love it when somebody turns around, as they have done in the past couple of weeks, and said, I've been researching X. In this case, it's a South African loco that we have at York. 1896 Sharp Stewart, so it fits into our 19th century remit. And he said, would you like it for the collection? Would you like it? Well, we're not going to accession it as a historic item, but we will put it in the history file. And those history files are distilled and made accessible. So whilst there are correspondence and other details that modern data protection won't let us share, where there are articles and research, we can photocopy those and put those in box files and lever arch files in our search engine facility, which some of you will have used, I'm sure, and that's accessible to everybody. If you go and look for the history files, we call those ones, in search engine, when search engine's open, anybody can pull one off the shelf and have a look at what's been written. And the very first pages will be very much a stripped down version of the object history file, including when the thing came into the collection, when it was restored, if it's been restored, the condition it's been restored to, and why that decision was chosen. So you might have something like one of the Midland Railway engines that the combination of the chimneys and the boiler fittings and the domes and all that lot can only go with a certain livery scheme. Published histories, I use, for example, Brian Reed's locomotive profile from the mid-1970s. It's very, very... does anybody know Brian Reed in the room? You knew him, Michael. Was he as dry as the book is? It's a very, very good history of the locomotive, but it's not particularly readable. And somebody as myself, as a museum curator, trying to unlock the stories of that engine, that we can tell them in a way to our visitors that makes, I don't think makes sense, but it's something where they take it home and say, gosh, I didn't know about that, or even bring it out at the Christmas party. It's not that, but it is a very valuable document. And you know, you come to our search engine and there will be so very, very many history books on locomotive types, locomotive classes, locomotive fleets of various railways. But the final thing that we know about our collection, and we're starting to do a bit more with, is object evidence. So we're very good as museum curators about reading stuff and looking things up and researching and using record offices and archives to find out what we can. But sometimes we forget almost the elephant in the room. We forget the actual thing itself. And you know, a locomotive will have the dents and the dings of its working life. The pipe work quite often on an engine will be bashed and clouted because you know the fireman's got fed up and he's had enough and he's taken the coal pick to the clack valve or something like that. Or bits have been replaced and materials have changed. Really, really quite interesting. But we move on. We do need to understand our collection because it helps our collections care if we know when it was restored, if we know what it's made of, if we know what's happened to it. And it helps us to draw up a conservation plan as to whether it can be lent out, whether it can be operated, whether it be considered for external display ever. But it helps our interpretation and exhibition. So at the moment, we are about to break ground for a new hall at Locomotion in Shildon. And that new hall will focus on industrial railways, colliery railways, Shildon, and goods traffic in general. But one of the first vehicles you will see when you walk into New Hall, as long as we get it right, will be Lion. Not Locomotion. Locomotion will be in the main hall, but in the building that celebrates and commemorates and interprets the colliery railways, the industrial railways, and doesn't put them as a byline, it has a building to itself. And I think that's something to celebrate, that Lion will be there, not might be, it will be there because we recognise its part in the story and the Hetton Railway, because of course she's much later than 1822, but it's the story that the engine represents. So it helps our interpretation and exhibition. We can say the truth about these things. It sets the record straight. We've had a number of people would say to us, you know, that's not right, that's not right. Well, it's not in the National Railway Museum's position to tell fibs. I did do a tour for local mayors a few weeks ago, and without wishing to get into the politics of the movement of locomotion number 1 from Darlington to Shildon, there were people muttering, saying, he's not got it right, he's not got it right. As the curator, you're wrong. And I said, well, with the greatest of respect, I am not in a position to fib. It does not behove me as the senior curator of the National Railway Museum to stand in front of you and tell lies. But what I am telling you is the authentic story of the creation of the railway and the creation of that locomotive. Because I don't want to get drawn into politics either, because we're not politicians, we're historians. And we are storytellers. And if it helps us to set the record straight, then that's fine. But I did draw the line at one of the party. He came up to me afterwards, and he's actually one of the chaps who has an allotment next to us in Shildon, and he came up to me and said, I know better than you. I know better than you. He said, they made engines at Brusselton, you know. My dad took me to the locomotive works at Brusselton, on the edge of Shildon. They didn't make them in Shildon. They didn't make them in Newcastle. They made 22 engines in Brusselton. I know better than you. I gave up and walked away. Yes. But that is now a story that is now doing the rounds of Shildon around the allotments. But apologies to the chap if you ever end up watching this, but there we are. But we do need to set the record straight. And that's where understanding the conservation and the stories of these locos begins, and where I begin to embarrass Dr. Michael Bailey. Because, like I said, throughout the 60s, 70s, early 80s, a lot of what we knew about the engines in our collection were from not just Brian Reed, OS Knock, H.C. Castley. It was a received wisdom that had been written maybe 20, 30 years before the museum was open, and what records did these folks have to hand. So I use Nelson, formerly known as Bradle, to illustrate this, because this engine was deeply misunderstood throughout the 60s and 70s, 50s. They knew it as an old engine, and an old engine that had survived because it had been a snowplough, but it was plonked on a plinth, very much as locomotion was, at Philadelphia, if I remember rightly, and then ended up here in the council yard in Shildon. A 19th century locomotive parked on a bit of track in the council yard. And going back to John's lovely introduction earlier, I do have a photograph here with a road roller parked alongside it. I haven't identified the road roller yet, but it's there in the picture. But you know, it's there, coated with tar, and property of the local borough council. Ownership of it passed to Sedgefield District Council sometime in the 80s, and it moved to outside the Timothy Hackworth Railway and Victorian Museum in Shildon. And everyone said, oh, it's an old engine. Timothy Hackworth made this old engine. And there was I think it was my brain's fallen over now, a conference on railway preservation with the then Association of Railway Preservation Societies, and Dame Margaret Weston, who was the head of the Science Museum at the time, National Museum of Science and Industry, said something must be done about this. And forgive me, Michael, I don't know the full story of how you got involved, but Michael was engaged with John Clitheroe on that one, with his friend John Clitheroe, both of them eminent engineering historians, to understand and work out what this is, rather than what it was. And here we have it now. It is the pioneering work, because nobody that I'm aware of had begun to challenge the received wisdom. Nobody had begun to read the objects in the same way that Michael and John did. And I think Nelson was your first locomotive, Michael, is that?
Not the first one, no. It was the third one.
Oh, the third one. Oh, well. It's the first one in terms of, I think, from the National Railway Museum point of view, that drew our attention to what we needed to do to begin to understand our locomotives. So, rather than being a misunderstood six-wheel lump in a council yard, it's put under cover in Kilburn's warehouse in Shildon, and it was conserved gently, because after all those years outside, like locomotion, it's fragile. It doesn't really want to roll, you don't want to push it anywhere, things might fall off. And yes, we do become precious museum curators when things fall off. It's a little bit embarrassing, because we are the keepers of the King's relics now, to get that right. But we need to look after them appropriately. And Michael's work, understanding Nelson, South Hetton engine, so we get Hetton in there somewhere, and led to further work on that first locomotive we saw on the slides, Rocket. Rocket, again, lots been written about it, lots of images, lots of woodcuts and lithographs from the 19th century, lots of ideas of how it might have looked, lots of models made. But what Michael and John did was connect those historic writings, the documentary evidence, or not evidence, with what they saw on the actual machine. And it was superb, because I think it was 1998, 1999. It wasn't done under closed doors. Michael and John took the engine to pieces and measured it in the Great Hall at York. And they explained what they were doing. And forgive me, Michael, I don't wish to embarrass you too much this morning, but I do regard this, Engineering and History of Rocket, as one of the seminal histories of a railway engine that's ever been written, because of the approach of taking the engineering, the object evidence, and the documentary evidence, and marrying it up to explain to us exactly what that poor old lump of iron that's useless and will never pull a train again, how it actually fits. So likewise, we will see, I see every so often now, you've shoved it in a corner at York. It's not, it's poorly lit. I can't take a decent photograph of it. What we have done is actually moved it out of London where it was, because people walked past it in Making of the Modern World, which is a lovely gallery, really interesting gallery, but people just walked straight past the engine to go and look at something else. What we now have is an international icon in the right place telling its story, and that will continue throughout all the redevelopments at York to come. Anyway, enough. I don't want to concentrate on any one engine because, as I say, we have so many 19th century locomotives. But there it is, the true form of rocket. And Michael and John's examination and study enabled us to re-engineer and rebuild the working replica of rocket in a far more authentic way. So when that engine had first been built at Springwell in 1979, the late Mike Sato and colleagues made compromises so that it would fit and operate in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, we knew it worked, and that was fine, but the work that Michael had done inspired my former colleague Jim Rees, who was then the senior curator of just rail vehicles then. He didn't get all the technology nonsense. But Jim Rees took the courage on, because that engine needed a new boiler, and said, can we re-engineer it so that it is much closer to rocket in 1829 than it is now. So a new boiler was made using the original drawings and other detail fittings, because rocket didn't have a steam dome. There were various things that the engine altered. Doesn't make it hugely look different on a 30-second viewing, but actually it made a lot of difference in the operation of the thing. And when we run it again at Locomotion in Shildon, do come down and have a look, because it is a real view into 19th century locomotive engineering. So that I do hold my hand up. I am a qualified past driver of rocket. I don't particularly get off on driving railway engines, but rocket is like nothing else on earth. But I go back to that point I made earlier about us telling stories. The fact that I can drive rocket means that I can then get my colleagues together with the interpretation and education teams and give them a go. And that's, I think, is also part of the incredible story, and the importance of the story is passing that on to people who don't necessarily. A lot of us in this room here have practical experience of railway engines. If you can turn to somebody and say, have a go at that. One of our conservation team in September, when we were being reassessed on it, having not run it since 2019, I passed out with the assessor, and I said to Katie, I said, do you want to have a go? Oh, I couldn't do that. I said, yes, you can. I said, I can do it, you can do it. And she came back and she floated off the engine. I think that's really, really important. I know it's getting off the subject of the conservation, but being able to present rocket as it really was is something that's very important. We don't have a mishmash now. We don't have a pastiche of a representation of an engine. We actually have a replica of the locomotive. What about the others then? What about them? What about Puffing Billy here at Swindon in 1990 when we moved it out of the Science Museum? One of the few times it's been outside the Science Museum, but really important. What about that? Still in Making the Modern World in London. What about Hetton Lion? Good question. What about Hetton Lion? Another engine that had been misunderstood by the experts depending on whose history you read. Was it a Stephenson engine? Was it not a Stephenson engine? Well, as you all know, after Michael's paper yesterday, well, you can all tell me. But Michael's paper came out of the work that he'd done with Rocket and with John. And John unfortunately had to bow out of the scene, but Peter Davidson joined Michael in his assessments of early locos. And the opportunity arose. A very kind sponsor said, I'd like to sponsor a survey in Lion. And we said, that would be fantastic. Because again, it's helping us put those legends to bed once and for all, so that we do know what it is, what it's made out of, where it was made and how it was made. And it's wonderful. You learnt all about that yesterday. And again, that's one of the reasons that Lion is able to take pride of place in the new hall next year, because it isn't just me who knows and is shouting at colleagues about it. Michael and Peter's information was put into a report and passed to senior management, all who have read it, and they all know and understand. So again, it's back to the National Railway Museum being the they, and they don't know anything. Actually, National Railway Museum, they all know about Lion. I think that's brilliant. Anyway, back off the soapbox. Lion was surveyed in 2019, pre-COVID, threw up challenges, threw up some frustrations. In the 21st century, one of our big bugbears is this dreaded word asbestos. And in the conservation of locomotives from the 19th century, you'd say, well, why on earth would there be asbestos in something as early as this? Well, of course, that's part of the story. 1925, the LNER decide to make this engine work again for the centenary of the Stockton-Darlington Railway. It's fitted with new tyres, they're all stamped, and of course to make it go, all the boiler door joints are now asbestos. And the price of asbestos remediation seems to be that, and therefore unfortunately there were parts that we weren't able to access and dismantle. One of the frustrations, and it really is. But that said, we enjoyed Michael and Peter's visits because, as with Rocket, they surveyed the loco right in the middle of the collections building at Shildon and were able to talk to our visitors about what they were doing and inspire and enthuse and engage. And I think that's really good, because whether it's a bus or a beehive or a locomotive, if people are able to look at something and have somebody from a position of knowledge and understanding explain it to them, and explain it to them in a succinct way, because say, Michael and Peter are able to pull out some of the most minute engineering details. We talk to people about how can you date it? Well, look at this steel plate here. Look at the threads, when Whitworth comes in. They're different, the constructions and the materials. This is all part of the assessment, which helps us as museum curators and interpreters tell the story of our collection so much better. And yes, now it is locomotion's turn. And this is perhaps one of the most exciting things for me of my professional career of the last 25 years, is that engine has had a lot written about it. It's had the Brian Reed monograph, written about it. But what actually is it? It's like Flying Scotsman in many ways. It's a collection of parts. I said that name. It's a collection of parts that bears the name Locomotion Number 1. But what actually is it? That's one for another time. But being able to take something that has been known about for well over a century and everybody thought they understood it, we know nothing. And it's really, really exciting times ahead. It really is. Yes, it is locomotion, but it's got so many stories packed up inside it. I can't wait to find out on Michael's next visit. But every loco is different. We concentrated this morning on pre-1840 locomotives, well, pre-1850, putting Lion in. But the 19th century continued, and we have a lot more engines from the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 1899, still a 19th century locomotive. But I'm conscious that we don't have a lot more time. But our treatment of them should be no different in terms of understanding where they've been, understanding what they are now, understanding what we're going to do with them. Because, yes, they look shiny on the outside, but they're rotting on the inside. Some of them, they have done. If we don't necessarily understand what's happening, what the materials are. So, over at Kirby Stephen East at the moment, we have the Fletcher 240 Northeastern Locomotive 910. When that arrived at Locomotion in 2006, we still found it had its last fire in the firebox. Now, that engine had been cosmetically restored for 1925, but the fire had remained in it. I'm afraid I took it out. because, you know, materials corrode, even slowly in a dry environment. It's still happening. So here we are, every loco is different. The Midland Railway Kirtley from the 1860s, very much a mishmash of material, and had been on loan to another venue for a number of years. Unfortunately, the roof had failed at the loan venue and the engine came back to us for conservation. All the boiler cladding had rotted underneath and the paintwork had crazed and corrosion was really gathering hold. The tender body and the frame were splitting from each other with corrosion. It was pushing the body apart. So we had it back, and this is it in August this year, just before it went off on loan to the Barrow Hill Railway engine shed in Derbyshire. This is a genuine original engine that worked out of Barrow Hill. They celebrated their 150th anniversary this year, so it was very important it went on loan to them for display. But as I was saying, it's a mishmash of things. We actually have documented in the object file a letter from the then librarian of the National Railway Museum, Phil Atkins, saying, paint it whatever colour you want because it's so inauthentic, you can get away with it. It should only be London, Midland and Scottish Railway black as to 2002 because that chimney was only fitted in 1940. But the rest of the engine, he said, is such a compromise that you could not authentically paint it any other colour than black. So in the 60s, no, sorry, in fact in the 50s and 60s, they painted it Midland Railway Crimson Lake because it was very attractive. So that is a stabilised and conserved paint finish because it was in such a poor condition. At a general viewing, you can't see the join. But if you spend more than a minute or two starting to look at it, you can see where our team have had to try and patch in and piece and feather in. If you're into furniture restoration, you know about feathering in of wax and polish to try and make sure that you've got a smooth finish rather than being able to see the join. And I think our team did a pretty good job with that. But really interesting when you find a letter in the files that said, you can't paint it any colour really because it's such a hodgepodge of things. And likewise, 10 years ago, we had a London North Western and Midland LMS themed event at Locomotion in Shildon. And there are two of our 19th century locos, Cornwall, much rebuilt LNWR loco initially from the earlier period, but heavily rebuilt, and Hardwick from the 1870s, both outside for 5 days at Locomotion. They got rained on. Now, of course, we might say, yes, a locomotive does get rained on, it gets outside, this weather happens. Well, they do when a locomotive is operating and running, and it's warm, and it's maintained, and people clean it. But something like this goes outside, and it gets rained on. Well, the first thing that happens is all the bright work goes rusty. You get the surface rust on that. But what happens where the water goes inside and the engine's not warm? The water will get between the cladding sheets on the boiler, it'll drop down the chimney, it'll go down through the safety valve cover, and who knows what it's up to there. If nothing else, it becomes unsightly as the rust starts to split through the back of the boiler banding, and people sit there and say, that's doing something, it shouldn't be like that. You haven't looked after the collection. You're not looking after it. So whilst this was done then, we probably wouldn't do it now. Ironically, Hardwick's a bit of an imposter as a 19th century locomotive because the boiler on it was made in 1926 by Ruston and Hornsby of Lincoln. So actually, the boiler on Hardwick is newer than several parts of Flying Scotsman. That's actually quite incredible. And that's part of the story that we found through researching the engine and looking into the records. So you know, the LMS had a batch of boilers. They couldn't cope at Crewe with production, and they had a batch of boilers made for these precedent locomotives by Rustons of Lincoln. Now, again, as a steamroller and traction engine man, I think that's high praise indeed, that Rustons were good engineers for whatever they did. They did aircraft, they did cars, they did all sorts of things, but I do like the fact that Ruston and Hornsby made the boiler for that. And whilst we probably wouldn't do that now, the ultimate is we probably wouldn't do that now. And this is 1982, the Great Central Railway at Loughborough in the Midlands, and as a small boy, as an 8-year-old, I was taken by my father to see the 1870 Stirling single operating in steam. Something I shall never forget, because even then I was aware that what I was seeing was something very, very special. And when we get accused of being precious museum curators, part of the story with these things, the engines that did steam, including Hardwick, which ran in 75 and ran on the main line into the early 80s, was that the then chief engineer, not there, John Bellwood, late John Bellwood, who's there, was a former BR mechanical engineer. And John went round and assessed every locomotive in the collection as to whether it could or would steam again. So he had the boilers inspected. He then hydraulically tested the boilers if they held a visual inspection. And then if they passed the hydraulic, they moved on to the steam test. Now, with as little work as possible. So this engine was not overhauled to run in 1982. It was assessed, it was tested, a small amount of work done, and then it ran for another 3 years. And then John said, right, okay, enough is enough. It won't take it another time. And he was actually quite gentle, quite considered. So in many ways, I regard this as controlled demonstration rather than running it on a heritage railway day in, day out. He was very gentle with it. Oops. And, you know, likewise with Cornwall. Yes, Cornwall did run on the main line, but it ran double-headed with other engines. It went on loan to the Derwent Valley Railway. It was operated very, very gently. The flip side of it is Cornwall, on the left, was assessed in the 1970s at the same time by John and his colleagues, and George Knight, the late George Knight, boilersmith, and it passed examination. It has a wrought iron boiler, that engine, and it passed its visual exam. They put a hydraulic test on it, and it passed the hydraulic test. So I should say the hydraulic test is where it's full of water and it's pumped up to 1.5 times its working pressure. And they were all ready to steam that engine for Rocket 150, for the 150th anniversary of the Rainhill trials in Liverpool and Manchester. And the late George Knight said, I'm going to have one last look at this before we put steam in it. And he took his boilersmith's hammer and he knocked it straight through the wrought iron boiler barrel at the Severn Valley Railway. And they said, right, that's it, game over for that engine. And, you know, there has been no talk of doing it since. We talk a lot. People do come to us and say, what about running this? What about running that? Can you run this? Should you run that? Will you run this? There's a lot to think about, as you've seen. But it's not to say that we don't. So one of the engines that is in our collection at the moment that has operated and will operate again, in fact several, we have London South Western Railway express passenger engine from the 1890s, it's called a T9, and we also have an engine called the BT Well Tank made in 1874. Both those engines have been assessed by engineers and curators and conservators to say, right, okay, what degree of intervention are we happy with? So BT Well Tank needs very little doing to it. It's had 2 spells of operation. It pretty much just needs a set of boiler tubes, which we regard as consumables on the engine, and it will run again. An engine from 4 years earlier, Stirling single, the fragility of it and the way that other parts of it are worn, we probably wouldn't consider it again. But also we have to put into the mix our requirements for our displays. So Great Hall at York, Station Hall, Locomotion Main Hall and the New Hall, they're actually our priority, is to tell our story of Britain's railways. If we can operate a couple of 19th century machines on top of it, even better. But we're not like Enterprise Rent-A-Car in the market for running everything. But I do believe strongly that we still should run things as long as we can, but we run them in a sympathetic way with people who help us and with a full understanding of the object, not just as a locomotive, but as an artefact. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.